Broadcasting live from atop the Rocky Mountains, the crossroads of the West. You are listening to the Liberty Roundtable Radio Talk Show.
Lowell Nelson, Donald Trump, Ron Paul, Jeffrey Tucker, daylight savings time, corporatism. It all starts now. Happy to have you along, my fellow Americans. I'm Sam Bushman, Lowell Nelson, campaignforliberty.org. With me, welcome to the show, sir.
Good to be with you, Sam. Thanks for having me on this beautiful Monday morning.
Ron Paul writes an incredible column, ladies and gentlemen, talking about the dangerous actions of President Donald J. Trump. He criticizes socialism and communism rightly, and we got to give President Trump a huge praise for that. But at the same time, he's backing corporatism, where government literally buys into business. And when they do that, it makes things go south, as Ron documents, Lowell.
Right. Ron Paul's saying here he has obtained ownership interests of approximately $27 billion in 30 companies just since January of 2025. It's obviously not a free market system when government buys ownership into companies. Basically, the Trump administration, they're going to claim that those investments will benefit the American people. But the truth is, this policy, it hurts us more than it helps us. How so, you might ask? Well, Ron Paul writes, quote, "The policy distorts the capital markets by incentivizing investors to support these companies because the investors believe the government's ownership interests creates a de facto government guarantee of a stock's value," end of quote. For example, after the government announced it would acquire 10% ownership in the chip manufacturer Intel's stock price increased. Well, parenthetically, folks, this is the one way government insiders get rich, right? They buy the stock before such decisions are made public, and then they sell that stock after the price increases. Pretty sweet deal, even though it's a corrupt deal. It's pretty sweet for them, right? Well, Ron explains why corporatism hurts us. Quote, "When investors allocate their resources to companies because government is supporting those companies, capital is deprived from businesses that can thrive by pleasing consumers instead of politicians. This reduces economic growth, harming consumers and workers. It also incentivizes other businesses to seek government investment instead of developing ways to better serve consumers," end of quote. So in other words, folks, corporatism invites more lobbyists to Washington, D.C. in hopes of currying the favor of government investment in their firms, too. This is roughly equivalent to the government taking money from you and giving it to companies you may not support and from which you may never receive a return. And this is corporatism, folks. This is crooked. Companies that receive
borders
this
on
kind of
fascism, though, if you really understand fascism as well, Lowell. It really does. I know they politically charge that term to where it means a bigot and a hater, but that's not really true. Fascism is really government control, private ownership kind of a thing. And it's just as dangerous, really. All these roads lead to socialism and communism because they tear down the free market, Lowell.
That's right. And they're playing games with us because they denounce socialism or they denounce fascism, right? But de facto, that's what they're doing. It's a fascist approach to business, and that's what corporatism is. It's just, I guess, soft fascism, you might call it. And it's wrong. It's flat out. It's not ethical. It's crooked, and it's not illegal, I guess, because the government is doing it. But it's certainly crooked and not ethical. So Dr. Paul says, you would think most Republicans would be alarmed at this and expect them to push back on this, but then you would be wrong if you assume that. Most Republicans are supporting this crooked scheme. In fact, most Senate Republicans have included a provision in their version of the 2027 NDAA bill that authorizes this policy. Why would they put it in that bill? Because that bill is going to pass, right? Everything they stuff into that bill, this National Defense Authorization Act, it usually passes. And it has
well,
passed,
I reject the corporatism and the fascism, whatever you want to call it, and I reject the NDAA as well. Shut that down. That's been just cranked up since 9/11. et cetera. And so, we just need to get the federal government out of these things which were never properly delegated to them via the Constitution in the first place. The sooner we do that, the sooner we can get back on track to the proper role of limited, appropriate, moral, constitutional government, Lowell. It's that simple.
Yeah, you're right. The Constitution is our blueprint for liberty, as you like to say. And if we would simply follow that document, the principles outlined in that document, then we would not have the problems that we have today. This 2027 version of the NDAA, by the way, this is also the bill that joins at the hip the militaries of the United States and Israel. And so this is a super bad bill, terrible bill, and it needs to go down in flames. And either that or they need to pull out a number of these wrong provisions from it. But Ron concludes his column this way, Sam, quote, "If the final version of the NDAA gives congressional authorization to President Trump's corporatist policy, the country will have taken a major step down the road to serfdom, and Republicans will have lost what little credibility they had left as supporters of the free market and limited government." End of quote. Well, if they were ever supporters of the free market and of limited government, that would surprise me. But, I mean, Ron Paul is just laying it out in spades for us here. We are on the path to serfdom. We are not anymore supporters of the free market and of limited government based on the way Congress is voting and the way the president is acting. Sam?
Yes, sir. All I can tell you is this. I think that Ron Paul's completely right. Sadly, as far as I can tell, maybe Thomas Massey, but nobody else in government that I can see either understands these principles or are willing to articulate them on the national stage, because this seems to be ignored. Congress seems to be going along with President Trump. I don't know if it's fear. I don't know if it's they don't understand. I don't know if it's their their arms are twisted by lobbyists. I'm not here to debate exactly why. I just know this. I don't see any real opposition on the national stage for this. Although the free market's clearly at stake, the Republicans are going to lose their last opportunity to say they're free market, people, or they're for lower taxes. Because once you agree to this, all bets are off when it comes to an independent, stable, level playing field economy. It'll be government manipulation. This started with TikTok with President Trump, really, right?
Yeah, I think so. They justify this activity because they say, well, we need to have, we need to supply the military-industrial complex, make sure that we have a reliable supply of, like chips, for example, their investment in Intel, they justify that by saying, look,
we have plenty of supply if we don't go to war at the drop of every hat, Lowell.
Right. That's exactly right. But that's how they justify this investment in Intel and whatever other companies they invest in. They always justify it by saying, well, we need it for national defense. We need it for the security of the United States. And it's just a short-term program anyway. It'll go away. Right. Yeah, these short-term programs never go away, Sam. Do you know a government? Can you name, on one hand, 5 things that, short-term programs that have gone away after they've been implemented?
I can't name one, because even when they go away, oftentimes they go back to the legislatures, and even anything that has been temporarily halted, they basically come back and they codify it and make it much, much worse. Usually that's what happens. I can think of plenty of times where they promised that it wouldn't be something and it turned out to be. Just think of the income tax. It was a war tax at first. They got it approved back in 1913, but they didn't do much with it. World War II came. They said, we got to have a war tax. And now it's really never ended. It's not called a war tax anymore, but the income tax basically got kind of wedged in that way. So we got to be really careful with this. But folks, it's hard to deal with these, in my opinion, tough, complicated issues like the economy and socialism and corporatism and fascism and all this kind of stuff. It's hard to wrestle with those issues because they're complex. But even something as simple as the time zones or the time of day, we can't even stop fighting about, Lowell.
This is a fun column by Jeffrey Tucker. He calls Gaming the Clock for Industry. I found this really interesting, Sam, as I read through it last night. It raises a point I had really never considered before now. And that point is that, once upon a time here in, before the 1880s in our country, apparently, every community set its own clock and they based it on the sun or what they called solar time. And so noon in St. Louis was a different time than noon in Kansas City. both of those cities today are in the central time zone, and today they do. Noon in St. Louis is the very same time as noon in Kansas City. Even though today they're separated by 4 hours, right? Kansas City is 4 hours west of St. Louis. And so, but before the 1880s, you might have 12 noon in St. Louis, but it wasn't noon yet in Kansas City. It was 11:42 because they were 18 minutes apart by the solar clock, because the sun was still rising toward its zenith in Kansas City when it was directly overhead in St. Louis. Very interesting, Sam.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, quick pause, right back. Hard-hitting news the network refused to use. Lowell Nelson, campaignforliberty.org on your radio.
The Foundation for Moral Law is a nonprofit legal foundation committed to protecting our unalienable right to publicly acknowledge God. The Foundation for Moral Law exists to restore the knowledge of God in law and government, and to acknowledge and defend the truth that man is endowed with rights not by our fellow man, but by God. The foundation maintains a twofold focus. First, litigation within state and federal courts. Second, education, conducting seminars to teach the necessity and importance of acknowledging God in law and government. How can you help? Please make a tax-deductible contribution, allowing foundation attorneys to continue the fight. You may also purchase various foundation products as well at morallaw.org. Located in Montgomery, Alabama, the Foundation for Moral Law is a nonprofit, tax-exempt 501c3 founded by Judge Roy Moore. Please partner with us to achieve this important mission. morallaw.org.
The debate over time zones keeps coming, ladies and gentlemen. Sam Bushman, Lowell Nelson, campaignforliberty.org, talking about daylight savings time. It passed the House. President Trump says he'll sign it. Will it pass the Senate? We'll see. But it's a big issue because we used to be on solar time back in the day. That just means wherever you are when the sun's exactly over your head at noon, that's how we set our clocks. Then they changed because of the railroads and corporatism. A lot of people were pushing for it, scientists, farmers, and everybody else. I think Ben Franklin came up with this idea, and it was one of his worst ideas of all. Well, I agree that we need a standard clock, ladies and gentlemen. Don't get me wrong. There's ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong, though. And sadly, it seems like we're always on the wrong side of it. We went to these time zones and everything else to benefit the railroads and corporatism, really. We see the same thing with Trump in our day. That's why we're kind of tying these two topics together a little bit. It's very interesting. When do we do things that are best for the people, for our health, for society at large, versus when do we do the best for the big corporate players that want things a certain way? It's very interesting in this. I mean, these two are identical topics in a way, Lowell.
Yeah, they kind of are. I just found it fascinating because I had really never seen a clock with two faces. But apparently the clockmakers between 1880 and the turn of the century, they would have two faces on the same clock. In fact, they'd be double-sided. So on one side of the clock, you'd see the solar time. On the other side of the clock, you would see the railroad time. and so, yeah, it makes sense to me that railroads needed to have, they needed to synchronize their clocks so that they could run a sensible schedule. But it just seems weird to me that was the solution for a while, and so people finally said, well, let's just go with one clock, one face on the clock, and they went with the railroad time, and so that's what we have today. But in 1917 is when the people in public service decided, well, we're gonna set the clock forward in the spring and back in the fall so that we have more daylight time, in the summertime, basically the summer half of the year. And so they invented this daylight savings time, which apparently, according to National Treasure, the movie, Ben Franklin came up with the idea. But it turns out that neither is really solar time. But standard time comes the very closest to solar time. Well, this year, like you said, Sam, Congress decided to end this insanity, and so they embraced daylight savings time in a bill, H.R. 139, H.R. 139, called the Sunshine Protection Act. Jeffrey Tucker writes, quote, "The sun does not need the government to protect it. We need protection from Congress." End of quote. I love
Amen to
that.
Heard
Once
that.
again, yeah. So this is really top-down centralized planning. I despise this approach. I don't care what Congress says about the time. I think states can do and ought to do what they want because the states are sovereign. And I hope that Utah and Idaho and other states will choose standard time. Apparently, this bill, H.R. 139, says, well, if before a certain deadline, if states choose standard time, they can keep their standard time.
Well, but here's the problem right now. The feds have asserted themselves control over the time and the time zones, and how certain states were able to retain their autonomy, like Arizona, versus other states. I don't really know. I'd have to dig into it and study it. But listen to this from the state of Utah. In 2020, the state of Utah passed a law saying that it would switch to permanent Mountain Daylight Time if Congress ever changes the law to allow states to do so. Under current federal law, states simply cannot adopt permanent daylight savings time on their own. But in 2025, Utah came to their senses at first. They changed course. They said, hey, they passed what's called HB 120, which says Utah would stop changing clocks. That's good. Utah would stay on Mountain Standard Time year-round, just like Arizona. However, if Congress later changes the federal law to allow permanent daylight savings time, then they'd switch to permanent daylight savings time instead. So the law essentially says we'll use permanent standard time for now because that's what federal law allows, but if they change the law, we'll go along. And what I think states need to do is they need to sue the federal government and say, listen, you guys are clowns. You have no authority over this whatsoever. There's no constitutional law that says you can do this. We're going to do whatever we want. And then the states would adjust based on what they think is best. That's personally what I think should happen. And you would say, well, no, Sam, that'll create just a bunch of craziness. I don't think so. I think most states are common sense. We would either go with Arizona or Arizona might go with us because Arizona's, on the same time with us some of the time because they don't change already, see? And so we could work this out with the states near us, and each state could decide what's best for them, and they could do it. That would be one way to go. Another way to go would be to let the states decide, but, going to universal time or UTC might not be a bad idea. Yeah, you got to get used to weird numbers, but maybe you go to the military clock. You use weird numbers, and the whole world could be on the same clock. You might wake up at 1,500 hours and stuff, but so what? Your body could adjust to the sun appropriately, and everybody could kind of do whatever time they wanted that way, but yet everybody would have the same reference, if you will. So there's a lot of ways to go about this, Lowell, and what I don't like is the feds just determining this, ignoring science, and every time they make a change, they seem to make things worse. They've already tried daylight savings time in other places, and it didn't go well, and they had to abandon it. Why are we going down that road again? Why don't we? Anyway, it's just amazing to me how we never let go of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, me too. I mean, we tried this back in '73 here in the United States. We tried to make daylight savings times permanent. Nixon signed the law, went into effect on January 1st of '74. Nixon left office in August, but by October, public outrage forced a rollback of the entire scheme. President Ford signed the legislation, which allowed, going back to standard time. And so, and ever since then, we've been springing forward in the spring and falling back in the fall, and we've continued that pattern to the present day.
So the answer right now is just to say, look, we're not going to go back and forth anymore. So there's no daylight time. And states can choose whether they want to be on standard time or daylight time or whatever time they want to lock in for their state, they can. I would encourage standard time because it's closest to the Lord's time. If you look at the stars, you don't have to make adjustments. And I would say that most people say that your circadian rhythm and your clock, scientists back this too, that standard time is probably the best way. So I would encourage standard time and never change again and leave it alone. And the time zones, I'd leave alone for now.
Yeah, the interesting thing, it would bring health and biology into this too, and there's numerous studies and data showing that there are the changing from one clock to the other. In the springtime is the worst. Springing forward to daylight savings time, there are more heart attacks and strokes in the week or the several weeks following that change than there should be. In other words, there's a spike in heart attacks. There's a spike in cases of obesity. There's a spike in sleep apnea and other problems. And there's a similar spike in the fall when you fall back, but there's fewer of them, apparently. So it's tougher to go to daylight savings time than it is to return to standard time. But the risk, it would affect 300,000 fewer cases of stroke if we would just stay on standard time, Sam. 300,000 people, their life would be better. So it not only is it wrong for the government, the central government, to impose this plan on the states when they have no authority to do so, but it's also unhealthy for Americans for us to be put in this position. So bad stuff.
I think for once, Congress, the Republicans should do this. They should say, you know what? We realize there's no real authority for us at the general level to do this. We would basically pass a resolution, not a law, but a resolution. And it would basically say, hey, we recommend standard time for everybody. States, do what you want. And then we change the law to match that reality, and then states can do whatever they want to. And so Utah, for example, as far as I understand, if given their choice, they'd go to standard time. They wouldn't change their clocks anymore, and they would already basically align with Arizona. Done. Yeah. Next. I think a bunch of other states in the West, you could just simply say, hey, west of the Mississippi states are doing this, east of the Mississippi states are doing that. I mean, there's so many ways you could go about it, but the least way, in my opinion, we should go is let all the bureaucrats, all the professional do-gooders in Congress, which really get nothing right and seem to just waste our time and our money and don't accomplish much. We should just leave them completely out of it, since the Constitution doesn't provide any delegation for this whatsoever. Lindsey Graham is one of the folks that never understood this either, Lowell.
Yeah, Daniel McAdams writes his column about Lindsey Graham, and it's not flattering. It's not a column praising him, I'll tell you that. Basically, it decries his hawkish political efforts, right? Quote, Senator Graham embodies everything wrong and sick about the American political class and about American foreign policy. He has advocated over his 4 decades as a politician in favor of every war and foreign conflict, end of quote. Well, he encouraged the Ukrainians to continue their fight in their disastrous war with the Russians, saying to Americans, quote, it's the best money we ever spent, end of quote. Well, of course, Graham was not spending his money. He was spending your money, about $200 billion of your money. That's what he was doing. And the Russians are not the only ones dying. Thousands of Ukrainians as well, 500,000 by some estimates, have also been killed fighting Graham's proxy war against Russia. And many of the Ukrainians were violently conscripted to be in the army, to be in that fight anyway. And so, McAdams says, quote, whatever the case and whatever your view on the war, each of those Russians and Ukrainians had wives and children and families who loved them and who have been devastated by the end of the most important person in their lives, end of quote. And Sam, that's the most important sentence in the entire column, recognizing the fact that these men and women who went to war had families, they had children, they had loved ones. Now and those loved ones have been deprived now of the continued existence of these people who got killed. And there's probably 500,000 of Ukrainians and probably more than that in Russian lives that have been lost in this stupid war. Well, Graham didn't care about them. He went home to his, quote, Tony flat on Capitol Hill with untold luxuries and a net worth of millions, end of quote. So, Sam... And
now they popped, his sister in there to get favoritism?
Yeah. It's sad. Right. When we need to end this murderous foreign policy, Sam. We've got to change that.
We've got to have a humble foreign policy, ladies and gentlemen. And we need to realize it needs to be a just war. We ought to not be in these unlimited wars. I'm Sam Bushman. For Lowell Nelson, thank you so much, sir. Have a wonderful day. LibertyRoundtable.com. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Lowell. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you right now, Lowell Nelson over at campaignforliberty.org just doing a phenomenal job as always. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Sam Bushman. God save our constitutional republic.